The gavel fell with a dull thud echoing through the sterile tribunal room. It wasn't a dramatic movie-style pronouncement, but the quiet, devastating finality of that sound was enough to make Mark's blood run cold. He watched the senior member close the file on his desk, a polite but distant expression on her face. Then the words that would haunt him for months to come: application dismissed. The respondent's counterclaim for costs is granted. Just like that, the dream of reclaiming his deposit, the hope of a fair go, vanished. He'd risked everything on this one hearing, and now he was out not just his life savings but facing an additional legal bill for the privilege. Mark and Sarah had spent their entire adult lives building towards this moment. Growing up in the outer suburbs of Brisbane, they'd seen firsthand the relentless climb of property prices. For years they'd scrimped and saved, working long hours, Mark as a builder, Sarah as a nurse at Logan Hospital, pouring every spare dollar into their superannuation and a high-interest savings account. They pictured a little place in Callinga, maybe with a decent backyard for their future kids, or something closer to the coast, perhaps in Redcliffe. The market seemed to defy gravity, but they believed in their hard work, in the Australian dream. They finally hit their stride in early 2026 with a healthy deposit ready. The news reports were still all about price growth, about the insatiable demand. They thought they were being smart, getting in before it went even further out of reach. Then came the perfect property, a charming older 3-bedroom weatherboard on a decent block in North Lakes, not too far from Sarah's work, with good schools nearby. It was on the market for offers over $720,000. They loved it instantly. The real estate agent, a slick character from a well-known local franchise, was all smiles and promises. The open home was packed, the pressure was immense. "It'll be gone by the weekend, folks," he'd declared, looking directly at Mark and Sarah. Driven by fear of missing out and genuinely believing in the property's value, they put in a strong offer, $750,000. It was accepted. The contract of sale was signed, the 10% deposit, a whopping $75,000, transferred. Mark and Sarah celebrated, feeling the weight of years of saving lift, replaced by the excitement of their new future. They started planning paint colors and furniture. The ink was barely dry on the contract when the first tremors hit. Whispers on the news became headlines. Capital city home prices begin to fall. Then, experts predict property slump could last a year, cut values by 10%. Mark and Sarah watched in horror as auction clearance rates plummeted in Sydney and Melbourne, then trickled up to Brisbane. Buyers abandoned auctions. Median house prices in the capital cities, after years of relentless growth, were actually lower than they had been at the end of 2025. Their perfect North Lakes home, the one they'd committed to, was suddenly looking like a very expensive mistake. The valuation report for their mortgage came back significantly lower than their purchase price. The bank wouldn't lend them the full amount. They were now in a bind, unable to secure the necessary finance. They contacted the real estate agent, then the seller, trying to negotiate a lower price. Explaining their predicament, the seller refused. They were on the hook for a property that was now worth less than they were contractually obliged to pay, and without the finance to cover it. The contract settlement date loomed large. What were their options? Could they walk away and just lose the deposit? The seller's solicitor informed them that if they failed to settle, they would not only forfeit their deposit but could also be sued for any additional losses the seller incurred when reselling the property. That's when the legal letters started flying, and Mark and Sarah realized they needed help. They initiated proceedings in QCAT, the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, hoping for a resolution. Their case before QCAT was grounded in the principle of unconscionable conduct, arguing that the market shift was so rapid and unprecedented that the sellers' insistence on the full contract price, knowing their financial position, was unfair. They also explored arguments around misleading or deceptive conduct under the Australian consumer law, suggesting the agent's assurances of rapid appreciation and the hot market had been misleading. Given the imminent downturn, their solicitor presented evidence of the sudden market correction, expert reports on property values and bank letters detailing their difficulty securing finance. The defense, however, was formidable. The seller's legal team argued that a contract was a contract. They pointed to the signed agreement, the clearly stated terms, and the fact that Mark and Sarah had engaged their own solicitor throughout the process. They highlighted that market fluctuations, whether up or down, were an inherent risk of property transactions. They countered that the agent's statements were merely sales puffery, not guarantees, and that property purchasers were expected to conduct their own due diligence. They presented evidence that the seller had been forced to incur additional holding costs and relisting fees due to Mark and Sarah's failure to settle. The senior member listened intently to both sides, asking precise questions about the timing of disclosures, the specifics of the contract, and the relevant sections of the Property Law Act 1974, Queensland governing property transactions. The air in the tribunal room was thick with tension. Every word weighed, every piece of evidence scrutinized. What would a fair go look like in this situation? In the end, the tribunal's decision was stark. The senior member acknowledged the rapid market shift and its impact on Mark and Sarah. However, she found that there was no unconscionable conduct on the part of the seller or misleading behavior by the agent that would allow for the contract to be set aside. The signed contract, the cornerstone of property law, held firm. Mark and Sarah had entered into a legally binding agreement. Their application to reclaim their deposit was dismissed. Furthermore, the seller's counterclaim for costs, including the difference between Mark and Sarah's offer and the subsequent lower sale price plus holding costs and relisting fees, was upheld. The final bill for Mark and Sarah wasn't just the $75,000 deposit they lost, but an additional $32,000 payable to the seller. They left the tribunal room utterly devastated, their future now looking very different indeed. Justice in this instance meant upholding the letter of the law, even if it felt profoundly unfair to those caught in its grip. This case, while heartbreaking for Mark and Sarah, serves as a powerful, sobering lesson for every Australian navigating the property market. It highlights the absolute critical importance of understanding what you're signing when you enter a contract of sale. In a volatile market, whether prices are soaring or plummeting, the legal principle of caveat